Okay, we have our panel. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Leake. I'm the Science and Environment Editor at the Sunday Times. And today we've got a very topical topic. We've just had the IPCC report. We've had the summary for policymakers on Friday and full report yesterday. All of it coinciding with the Conservative Party speaking out in the form of Owen Paterson, Osborne, and Michael Fallon last night, who hinted that he even wanted to remove most carbon taxes. And looking back a few years, we had what was meant to be the greenest government ever, and now that's looking a little bit different. There are even signs, Greg apart, that we might be looking at the same kind of route that we see in Australia, where carbon taxes have become a party issue. And even climate change and climate science have become a party issue.
No, it hasn't. That's rubbish.
You can address that in any way.
No, that's rubbish. Absolute rubbish.
And in Britain we've had the Green Deal, which I hope Greg's going to just briefly allude to at some point. A great idea, rather brought down by Treasury interest rates. And now we're looking at a green industrial policy. Well, it's a great idea. It sounds good, but who in government is going to support it? And I'm not quite sure how much I need to introduce our panellists. Greg, I think we all know, but Greg's going to go first. Then I'm going to ask.
You've got first, John.
Yes. Just cheering in an equitable and just and fair fashion. Paul Ekins, who's I'm going to ask to speak second, is Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at the UCL. He's a member of Ofgem's High-Level Sustainable Development Advisory Group and has been a consultant to the government in a variety of ways. Third, I'm going to ask Dr. Moselle on my left here to speak. He's a Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting, an energy economist with a long-standing interest in climate change policy, and formerly a Managing Director at Ofgem. And then last, I'm going to ask Guy Newey of Policy Exchange to speak, all for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to questions. So, Greg.
Thank you very much for that very impartial and objective introduction, the sort of quality insight that we expect from the Sunday Times, with that sort of pithy, empirical analysis. No, most of what you said there, Jonathan, was absolute.
You can't attack the chair.
I'm just trying to choose my words carefully. Basically, it was a travesty and of the truth. That is the story that you're trying to write. That is the story that a lot of people would like to write. I can see the attractions because it makes much better news, it makes much better reading if you can set up two opposing camps, play one off against each other, the battle of ideas, the moving of the battle lines back and forth. But in actual fact, the green agenda in the Conservative Party is firmly rooted, not least at the very top, in David Cameron. If you look at his interview with the Sunday Telegraph this weekend, where he said very clearly, "I am not a Lawsonian," where he spoke out very clearly of the need not just to accept but to act on the evidence of dangerous man-made climate change of the IPCC. There's froth around the edges, but the bottom line is, firstly, there is absolute not blind acceptance of the science, but a clear acceptance that the overwhelming body of scientific opinion has now come out with the IPCC in the form of their strongest and most rigorous report to date, building on and moving on from the mistakes that were made in the previous report. This is a robust piece of evidence-based analysis, and it's the job of us politicians to act upon and listen to that advice. And I think the analogy that David Cameron used on Sunday, which is to say, if you had a 95% chance of a house fire, would you listen to the other 5% of people who are saying that there wasn't a chance for house fire before you bought insurance? Of course you wouldn't. And we just have to be sensible, prudent, and stop trying to see this in some sort of great psychodrama. The evidence of man-made climate change is not the big debate now. The big debate is how do we respond to it? And there is a debate, because for too long, people in the environmental movement, many of the sort of vested interests in the environmental movement have somehow assumed that the usual laws of economics, the usual discipline of good value, that the expectation to explain yourself transparently to taxpayers and consumers didn't apply to them. That somehow, because there was a noble cause, that the usual laws of economics and accountability somehow didn't apply. And the last 3 years, the last 5 years have been extremely difficult, and it's been under sharp relief under the current government. That as we've tried to deal with the financial mess that we've inherited and turn around the very, very difficult economy, and that has meant we've brought, we had to take off the rose-tinted spectacles and deal, very realistically with the consequences of the economic catastrophe that we inherited from the Labour Party, and add up every single programme in government and every single impact on consumers, whether that's through tax or whether that's through levies on their energy bills or whether that's the squeeze on their cost of living, and make sure that we're doing the right thing in the most cost-effective way. So there is a new hard-nosed rigour, and I have been a champion of that, of taking off the cotton wool and making sure that we encourage the what you might call the low-carbon goods and services sector, in the clean energy sector, to commercialise sooner, to scale up faster, to reduce subsidy quicker. I've been a champion of that for 2010, because if, like me, you fundamentally believe that the low-carbon sector is a viable economic proposition, if you believe that actually enhances the competitive edge of the country, then you don't want it to be kept in a petri dish on a drip feed of subsidy, given special treatment, increasingly attracting the ire of consumers and the hello. It's my mobile phone. No, exactly. You're off message. But increasingly attracting the ire of consumers. If it's only by showing that we are using subsidy not just fairly, but in a way that generates economic growth as well as acts on climate change. It's only by demonstrating that we too are tightening our belts, we too in the sector are tightening our belts in the way that every other area of the economy is having to. It's only if we show that we're not just taking for granted that we get money thrown at us, and that there is a clear trajectory towards grid parity for renewables, or for other forms of the low carbon economy that gets support, that there is a breakthrough moment when it gets through to prosperity. All of those things have to be right, and that's what differentiates us from the Labour Party. We bring real financial rigour. We bring a questioning mind to all of these policies, and it's right that they should be re-examined as we face this huge economic challenge of turning around the economy and getting back on a sustainable growth path. So, yeah, there are colleagues who are, less green than I am, of course, and there are, who maybe don't have the empathy that I do for the agenda, or maybe lack some of my passion. But there is nobody that I know, and certainly not the Chancellor, who is fundamentally questioning that climate change it isn't happening, or isn't questioning that we need to respond to it. The question is, what is the most effective response, balancing the interests of consumers, taxpayers, and the rest of the economy? And if you look at what this government's actually done, rather than the sort of fringe froth, if you actually look at what we've done, it is very substantial indeed. This isn't a government that has indulged the green sector, or has indulged in half-hearted measures. This is a government that put £3 billion into a green investment bank to create an industrial or an entrepreneurial partnership with the private sector to drive forward the green economy at real scale. Not some piddly little carbon trust style, quango with let's have a few tens of millions of pounds that we can announce this year and pull it out next year, and then we'll announce something else to create a new quango. We have created a huge, enduring financial institution that is now a permanent piece of the architecture of the City of London, not some little ministerially responsible quango. This is a really big piece of kit that we have now placed into the British economy. Not just £3 billion, but an additional £900 million this year, ponied up by the Chancellor. And in due course, the Green Investment Bank will be allowed to borrow. And it is doing incredibly well in the months that it's not yet a full year that it's been up and running in its absolute form, although there was a shadow before that. It is already getting a 3-to-1 leverage on its investment. And I know from talking to international investors that not only are they interested in the model, but also they see this as the UK having skin in the game. So that when I negotiated a £1 billion strategic alliance between us and Masdar of Abu Dhabi to invest in our green economy, they saw the Green Investment Bank, their co-partner, as being a clear indication of the long-term commitment of the British government to growing the low-carbon goods and services sector and clean energy in particular. But it's not just the Green Investment Bank that is a sign of our commitment. There is the way in which we ring-fence the science budget in times of austerity, £4.6 billion in the current spending review, of which there's several hundred million pounds are ring-fenced for DEC to encourage research and development in low carbon.
Great.
Yeah. Oh, 2 minutes, right? Yeah. You shouldn't be so provocative in your opening. But you've got the Technology Strategy Board, £440 million over next year, £20 million with DEC funding marine energy. We've got a huge programme supporting the rollout of electric vehicles from the Department of Transport, creating the most exciting electric vehicle manufacturing hub in Europe. I haven't even come on to the Green Deal, but what I did want to just address this central point of the meeting: should we be picking winners? Should we have a green industrial policy? No one ever has a problem with governments picking winners. It's simply a misnomer to think that people are worried about picking winners. It's picking losers that people start to complain about. So we've got to be in a position where we're not going back to the 1970s, which has become a bit of a theme for this party conference season. The trouble with industrial policy in the UK is it's always seen through the prism of managing the economy, not for reasons of economic competition, but in order to achieve social ends, to prop up failing industries, to look after vested interests or vested trade unions or particular parts of the countries which otherwise would be sinking. That is, that way lies economic failure. We've been down that road with Harold Wilson. But there is a role for government to recognise where there's market failure, which there clearly is in the climate change agenda. There is a role for government to partner with sectors to support research and development, to make sure we have the right skills, to make sure we're training the workforce, to make sure that there are financial incentives, whether that's promoting renewables or promoting shale gas. There is a role to make sure we have the right infrastructure. There is a role to make sure that ministers in looking for overseas markets are working hand in hand, as I do, to work with companies, because that's what our competitors are doing. Certainly in the developing economies, you're kidding yourselves if you think that Chinese, that Japanese, the Thais, the people in South America aren't all working hand in gloves with their key sectors. So yeah, there is a race. We're partners in that, but that's not the same as going back to a sort of old style Harold Wilson / Ed Miliband vision of a sort of of a partly nationalised big state, bossing around companies.
Thank you, Greg. Paul, would you like to address?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to stand up if you don't mind, and I can see people properly. I'm very grateful actually that we've got the IPCC report out of the way, because it means I don't need to do it. As a scientist myself, not a climate scientist, but someone who keeps in touch with the science, I have very little doubt that the 95% that the IPCC talked about is about it. I've heard John Gummer say that we all take out house insurance on the basis of a 0.02% probability that our house will burn down. And of course, for the great majority of us, it doesn't. The cost of the climate change agenda in this country is rather less than the average house insurance taken out by the average householder. Probably many of you, certainly me. And therefore, I think we need to keep this in perspective. My framing of the talk, therefore, is that we have a Climate Change Act, which was passed with all-party support. It has set out a clear roadmap for reducing carbon emissions. I'm very pleased to belong to a country that has seen what needs to be done and has put in legislation the fact that our politicians are determined to do it. It means that when I come to look at my children, or one child in my case, and perhaps grandchildren in due course, I will be able to say, well, our politicians did what needed to be done when the science seemed clear. That's important to me. I hope it's important to you too. But Greg and others, and the purpose of this meeting, therefore, is to say, what is the best way of meeting these targets? And by best, I mean the balance between short-term costs and taking advantage of the longer term, not necessarily long term, but longer term industrial opportunities. And I'm persuaded that these industrial opportunities are potentially very great indeed. Unfortunately, there are short-term costs, and it's about the worst possible time politically to be facing short-term costs. That's why it's terribly important that policy is smart and that policy does what it can to minimize those short-term costs while putting in place what needs to be put in place for the long-term opportunity. That is not easy, and it's not at all surprising to me that there are huge political arguments as to how this should be achieved. What are these opportunities? Clearly, energy efficiency in homes, in businesses, in buildings, in industry is an enormous long-term opportunity. There are so many studies that suggest that if we can mobilize that investment in energy efficiency, it will pay for itself in shorter than normal commercial timescales. Again, Greg knows better than most people that actually mobilizing that investment is not easy, and no government anywhere in the world has found it easy. Then there are the low carbon energy sources, particularly from my point of view renewables for reasons I'll explain later, but also nuclear. Not shale gas as far as I'm concerned. Shale gas is gas, which is not a low carbon energy source. It may have a role to play in Britain's energy mix going forward to 2050, certainly does, and whether it's shale gas, which would be good for the UK economy, or come from some other source, remains to be seen. And then there are low carbon vehicles. I was at the launch recently of BMW's new electric vehicle, lots of razzmatazz as you'd expect from BMW. The big car makers are starting to take this agenda seriously now, and clearly we need to decarbonise electricity before an electric vehicle is a low carbon vehicle, but provided that's part of the agenda, as it is, then that's obviously an enormous industrial opportunity, and the UK automotive sector needs to respond. So as an economist, why is it, as a supporter of some kind of industrial policy, why is it not enough just to say, let's stick in a carbon price, have the carbon price gradually escalating over time, and let business do the rest? That's the standard economic formula with which most or many of my economic colleagues agree. And I think that there are lots of reasons for that. I'm a great fan of carbon energy pricing. I was a great fan of the European Union's attempt to introduce a carbon energy tax in the early 1990s. I did studies on it that showed it was a good thing. But for all sorts of European-type reasons, it didn't get through, and we were left with the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which was developed once it became clear there wasn't going to be a European carbon energy tax, and we had Kyoto commitments to fulfill. So I love carbon energy taxes as a means of decarbonising and responding to the climate change challenge. But as I say, it's not enough. I've been given 2 minutes to explain why it's not enough, and I can't do that in the detail that I would like. But it's to do with the fact that it is very difficult to introduce taxes. When I heard the chief executive of ExxonMobil in the United States, which has been, as many of you will know, very hostile to any kind of climate change policy over there, when I heard him call for a carbon tax, then I knew that it was because that would effectively kill the agenda as far as the US was concerned. We're better at it here, I'm pleased to say, much more rational, but nevertheless it's difficult. There are other market failures. We need to give specific strategic attention to supply chains and skills. Renewables have specific advantages, which in my view justify their subsidy status. If we can crack the technology, they're zero cost, they're secure, they're non-depletable, they have given proven evidence of cost reduction across a number of technologies. I can think of nothing better this generation could give to the next generation than a functioning renewables industry with non-depletable, zero marginal cost power forever. So that's part of the promise. There are obviously challenges too with renewables, which I don't need to go into now. We can explore those in the discussion later. So I think we need carbon pricing to the maximum extent possible, and I'm worried when I hear the Chancellor and others saying that we need to roll back carbon taxes. But we also need a key focus in industrial policy on low carbon technologies. And actually I've said nothing, as I think Greg also said, that the government isn't already doing. So is it doing enough? And here I suppose I have to be controversial at some point. I don't think it is, because I'm afraid that despite having been elected on the platform of greenest government ever, that has now worn a bit thin, especially in energy policy. It doesn't help to see ministers from the same department fighting. It doesn't help to see secretaries of state from different departments that are both supposed to have an interest in this agenda, who obviously disagree fundamentally with each other. So I think in order for people like me and investors to believe in the low carbon story in this government, there need to be targets. There needs to be a decarbonisation target for 2030, which was only narrowly not put in the energy bill, and there needs to be a renewables target for 2030 to reassure the renewables investors who have many billions of pounds lined up to invest in the renewables industry in this country, to reassure them that they're not going to be left with a lot of stranded assets after 2020 through a government change of direction, but they will be able to continue to exploit the factories and the skills that they will hopefully put in place between now and then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Greg, for that heckling. And Boaz, targets for decarbonisation and renewables. Interesting ideas.
Thanks, President. Okay, great. Thank you. Let me come to that. But let me first give it some context. So, I guess, like previous speakers, the starting point in a way is the IPCC. I think it's very clear that the science is unequivocal, and it's slightly depressing that we even have to say that. I think the other point that I would take from the IPCC is that as the science has become clearer, the message has also become darker. So for me, the most chilling thing in the IPCC report is the forecast that with current policies globally, we could see warming over this century of up to 5 degrees centigrade, which is an unimaginable change and an unimaginably rapid change. So as we all know, those of us who want to know, this issue is incredibly serious. It's second to none. So that's the first element of context, let's say. The second element is another set of sort of depressing facts. So let's just look at the rest of the world. So step back from the UK and step back from Europe and look at slightly tougher places in the world. The world really loves fossil fuels. Okay, so let's go to China. People sometimes say China is coal, coal is China. China is the biggest producer of coal in the world. It's the biggest consumer of coal in the world. Every year, China adds 50,000 megawatts of new coal-fired power stations. Right? In other words, if we shut down today, all of the coal-fired power stations in the UK, 6 months later, China would have built the same amount in China. And it's forecast to double its coal consumption in the next 20 years. Okay? Then let's go to the United States or to Russia. Also kings of coal, they have bigger coal reserves than China, and also big places for oil and gas. And as we know, the United States is just renewing its love affair with fossil fuels because non-conventional oil and non-conventional gas are great for the United States. They've restored heavy industry, they help national security and so on. And then we can go to Canada and to Australia. What we can see is that there are lots of fossil fuels in the world, and the people who own fossil fuels are very determined to take them out, extract them, sell them, burn them. So there's a mismatch, if you like, between the sort of terrifying news from the IPCC and where the rest of the world is headed. So then you ask, should we have in the UK targets for renewables, targets for climate change? Should we have a green industrial policy? And I think the answer is, well, in light of what the IPCC is telling us, yes, clearly, but in light of the seriousness of the situation, it has to be one that works. It has to be a successful green industrial policy. And what does success look like? Well, I mean, Paul, I also have children and hope to have grandchildren someday. And what I don't want to do is tell them, you know, we did the right thing, but the rest of the world didn't follow. So actually it didn't make much difference. Okay? So the truth is that if we decarbonise in the UK without affecting the rest of the world, the impact is pretty negligible. And actually, even if the EU decarbonises, the impact is pretty negligible too, because the EU is a small part of the world's carbon emissions. So a successful carbon policy can only be one that deals with what the rest of the world is doing. So to me, there are two elements of what should be a green industrial policy. First of all, it has to be a European policy because the UK on its own just won't have any impact at all, right? Our ability to affect what the rest of the world does, if we do something different from our European partners, has got to be minimal. Okay? Having said that, Europe should have a green industrial policy which is really focused on trying to change the rest of the world. So what does that mean? It means developing technologies which might make fossil fuel unattractive, and the only thing realistically that will make fossil fuels unattractive is to have ways of generating energy that are cheaper than fossil fuels. Okay? So things like new forms of nuclear, advanced, much, much cheaper forms of solar PV are possibles, but those aren't things that exist right now, and spending an enormous amount on deployment of existing technologies just doesn't get you there. So our current aim is spending a lot of money, by the standards of other programs, without really getting where it should. Secondly, carbon capture and storage. In other words, if we think that people are going to burn those fossil fuels, as they very likely are, then having technologies which are affordable, which allow you to bury the carbon dioxide, that seems essential. It's really hard to imagine how we can get there without those technologies. And thirdly, and it's kind of a dark message, but it's quite likely that we won't be very successful as a world in dealing with our carbon habit, and therefore we need to think more about adaptation, and it's a dark thought, but it is now coming onto the agenda, we need to think a bit more about geoengineering. Right? So geoengineering got its first mention by the IPCC, and it's very contentious. It's a dangerous policy, but it's less dangerous than doing nothing. And again, we have to be realistic about our place in the world. The rest of the world will do geoengineering if it has to, even if we don't do it. It's actually, this is one area where the UK probably could take a lead, because we're good at basic science, we're good at institution building, we're good at diplomacy, and those are some of the things that we could be doing around geoengineering. So yes, a green industrial policy, but the one we have now doesn't address the challenges that we face.
Many thanks, Boaz.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm going to start off telling the story of a technology. It was a technology that was started in 1947 when engineers kind of worked out how to do it. Then nothing really happened with it for another 30 years, and then the technology that it was going to competing against became more scarce, and you had a price signal going on, and so government started getting involved. They paid for demonstration projects, they worked through improving different techniques. In 1980 they produced a tax credit for the technology. Continued more demonstration, etc., etc. And then in 1998, it happened commercially for the first time, with the private sector doing it on its own. And then over the last 5 or 10 years, it changed the energy system and lots of the assumptions in the energy system. Of course, the technology I'm talking about is shale gas, and I'm not talking about it because I think shale gas is going to solve the world's climate problems. Of course it's not. The point I'm trying to make when you're talking about a green industrial policy is that shale gas has quite useful and important lessons for how the government's role should be, and some of the limits. So the first point I want to make, and it's been alluded to before, and I commend Paul's work in this area, is that price signal and price signals matter intensely. And that leads you pretty quickly back to the idea that if we don't get carbon pricing working, I tend to favour getting the ETS improved, and we've done work on how that can work. But if you don't get pricing going at a European level, then we're not really serious about tackling this issue of climate change. And that's an important kind of political reality that we have to move forward. Price signals matter, and they matter in a way that didn't seem to be understood in the speech by Ed Miliband at the Labour conference, and I'm sure we'll probably get into that in questions. So prices matter, but also government matters is the other lesson from shale and other technologies, especially in the early stages, building, demonstrating these technologies work. There's no doubt. There's definitely a role for deployment, although the stronger the price signal have, as the Stern Review pointed out, the less need you need for deployment support. And we had a collapse in technology R&D after liberalisation. It was partly that's a result because we weren't spending a fortune on a very, very expensive nuclear programme, but it created a problem for a few years. And there are institutions, and Greg talked about the Green Investment Bank, that are trying to counter some of those pressures. The third point I'd have to make about government intervention and where green industrial strategy goes is government has to make choices about which technologies to support. They can't have a kind of all of the above approach, especially in a limited context. And that's one of the reasons why Policy Exchange was so negative about the 2020 renewable energy target, because that kind of short-term target drives you to what we consider kind of too fast deployment of less than mature technologies, and you risk wasting a lot of time, effort, and people's money, and it creates some of the political problems which we're grappling with at the moment. Some of the points that Boaz made in his paper about what are the right criteria, it should be these are globally important, which technologies are globally important, and where can we make a difference in reducing the global cost of those technologies. And if we started having a discussion on that basis, which to be fair the coalition has tried to put forward, that's a much more interesting discussion than how the hell do we get 15% of our energy by a particular date. So the point I want to stress is, yes, price signals matter, government matters, we need a public innovation system, but we also need to make some hard choices about which technologies we think are going to be important.
Thank you, Guy. Now we have the fun bit where we have questions. I'm going to take two at a time. Could anyone who wants to ask questions give their name and affiliation, and please make sure there's a question mark at the end of your sentences. Who'd like to go first? Gentleman there, and at the back, right at the back. And if you'd like to just say, rather than go down the panel and ask every question to every panellist, I'd rather focus it. So if you have a particular person you're thinking of, please do say.
I'm Gareth Morgan from the RSPB. It's really a question for the Minister. I assume I work for one of the green vested interests to which you refer. I mean, in practice, I think we do what we say on the tin. The reason we're worried about climate change is the biggest threat to the natural world. So that's why we're engaged in this debate. And I think you're a little bit unfair in your assumption that it's somehow the media or the public that's created the perception about the government lack of clarity on this. It was great to hear our friend Joan Patterson making very clear he believes in anthropogenic climate change. He did spoil it somewhat by saying it might be a benign outcome from that. We really need very clear signal right from government that this is a really serious issue, and then we can have a debate about the means rather than the ends. So I suppose my question is, can you persuade for example, the Chancellor to make a very clear speech about the ends in this matter, and then we can get on to the useful discussion about whether we approach it through market mechanisms or state mechanisms or whatever. Unless we get that clarity, I think it's going to be difficult to move on to the debate you want to have about the means.
Okay, and the gentleman in the...
Can I just respond to that? I think there really is the clarity. There just is no question that there is no senior member of the government that doesn't believe in man-made climate change. The Prime Minister was absolutely equivocal on Sunday in the Sunday Telegraph. The Chancellor, I think, I can't remember if it was I didn't listen to his speech. I don't know if it was something an interview that I read or a transcript of his speech, but he's equally clear. And the idea that somehow there is some hesitation around the science of climate change is just nonsense. So we really do need to move on. That is not helpful to try and see division where none exists. Yes, there are people who have different views on how much it's right to spend, where we should focus our energy, and that's a lively debate in government, as well as in other parties and across the political spectrum within different groups. I bet within your own group there are people who have slightly different ideas of what the focus should be. But the idea that there isn't a clear acceptance that it's happening, we're man-made and we're part of the solution as well as the problem is nonsense.
I think the confusion, Greg, is not that... I think everyone accepts that the science is generally not being questioned, but there seems to be a lot of confusion over the right response. And
that's what I said. I mean, not a confusion of the right response. We haven't just taken 2 energy bills through the through Parliament. We've just gone through electricity market reform, which has involved prolonged negotiations with the Treasury and the and my department and Number 10 in order to have a confused response. We're very clear. There are people who have individual views on things, but the actual structure of government policy is very, very clear. And we've done, let's be clear, we've done much more than any government ever before us. I mean, apart from passing a Climate Change Act, which is about setting a load of targets, what did the last government do? What was their big achievement, apart from setting a load of targets, that the last government actually did?
Well, they created a quite useful framework.
No, you're answering the question.
Apart
Apart from setting some targets, anyone in the audience, apart from setting targets, what did they actually do? Martin, one hand. I think that speaks,
hold on.
that speaks volumes that one hand went up.
Martin, I'll come
One
to
hand
you.
went up. That is in itself, I hope you note, Chair, a telling response that nobody could think of something other than setting targets that the last government in 13 years actually did.
Okay, right.
Sorry, let's hear from Martin.
No, I'm chairing.
Sorry, I've had too much coffee.
You really wound him up at the start, Jonathan. You really did.
Go decaf.
Yes, just another question to the Minister. I'm Peter Cheney, I'm from the policy magazine Agenda NI. Just wondered, has the Minister read Dieter Helm's book, The Carbon Crunch, or heard of it, and has he got any thoughts on Dieter Helm's conclusions on climate change and energy policy?
I know Dieter. I haven't actually read his book. I'm familiar with some of his arguments. What were you particularly...
Particularly interested in the case that there's investing so much renewables in Europe would be trivial if we continue to consume goods, coal-based goods from China and India. Basically we're fueling climate change by basically our consumption is basically continuing to depend on.
So we've exported our carbon.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's a degree of truth in that, and there is this argument around consumption-based emissions. And I've just come back from the International Climate Talks in Newey, the meeting of the Major Economies Forum. And let's not, we beat ourselves up in a room about what the UK is doing. And the reality is, what we are doing per se is trivial compared to the rest of the world. We actually are doing incredibly well for our 2% of emissions. What I know from looking around the G20 countries that sit around the table with me in negotiations, that I can hold my head up high, we're doing our bit. But unless they all do their bit as well, it really doesn't matter. So we do need China, America, the big economies to actually take a stand. And there's a lot more that they need to do. But I think there are encouraging signs that they are starting to move in that direction. I had some very good meetings with the Chinese climate negotiator. On Friday I signed a memorandum of understanding with the governor of Guangdong. I'll be leading a clean tech mission to China later in the autumn. The Chancellor's going to China in the autumn as well. America it has got some degree of political leadership now from the President on this, and most encouraging of all, the President of China and President of America have agreed to meet in September 2014 at the UN to talk about mobilising the climate agenda ahead of the Paris COP in 2015. It's a long way around of saying, Dieter's got a point, we can't solve it on our own, we need a global solution.
Right, Paul, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is the answer I would have given, that okay, it happens to be true that we're consuming a lot of goods from China, and a lot of those goods are made with coal, but so what? And what do we do about it? If saying that therefore we shouldn't bother to do anything about our own energy system seems to me an extraordinarily illogical and perverse conclusion. Actually, China is doing a huge amount, and much more than might be expected from a country that still has per capita emissions about a quarter of those in the EU and about a sixth of those in the United States and the rest of North America. So it is the largest investor in wind in the world, it is the largest investor in photovoltaics in the world, it is through that investment in photovoltaics largely responsible for photovoltaics having come down by about 80% in price over the last 5 years. So China is actually recognises the science, and unfortunately the science suggests that China is going to be even worse hit by climate change than we are, so it had better recognise the science, and given its level of development and the huge social issues that it's wrestling with, the largest scale urbanisation programme that has ever gone on anywhere in the world that it's completely incapable of controlling, it just has somehow to manage that. This is obviously a very, very difficult situation, but I agree absolutely with Boaz that it's the technology stuff that's going to is going to crack this, or we probably disagree about what technologies are going to crack this, but China's certainly doing its fair share to develop those technologies, as indeed is the United States in its own way. I mean, it pretends it's not doing anything at all, but I mean, actually, it's investing an enormous amount in renewables as well, and these technologies, wind, solar, are coming down in price. So we don't need to look to a completely new solar technology. What we need is another 50% cost reduction in solar panels on top of the 80% cost reduction we've seen over the last 5 years. And the people I know working in the photovoltaics industry suggest that that is by no means impossible over the next 3 or 4 years. And then that will need public support to continue to roll that out. And by then, I hope, we can see the markets pick it up and the market, entrepreneurs taking it forward in the normal kind of way. So you'll have gathered I'm a little more optimistic than some of the people further down the table. I think there is still a very great deal to play for, but I think we've got to do it together. We've got to share the technological burdens, and China is already doing a fair bit.
Okay, many thanks. Gosh. Right, okay, gentleman at the back, who had his hand up quite some time ago, and the chap next to him, Martin, was it?
Yeah.
We'll take
Thank
two
you very much,
questions now.
Dr. Ashcroft, I'm a GP. I'm interested in these things. Once upon a time, as Friends of the Earth many years ago, and I'm quite eco. I've got solar panels on my surgeries, on my house. But one of the, I'm a realist as well. One of the obvious things that we
get to a question.
The question is geoengineering. It's one of those things. It's a bit like sex education for children. We don't want to discuss it in case they go off and do it, sort of thing. It's probably the way forward at the end of the day. Just get rid of the carbon down into the deep sea.
Okay, I'm not sure that's a question. What are you?
Can I perhaps respond to that? Because I know a thing about geoengineering.
Just I want to take two questions.
I'm sorry.
And the gentleman just on your left. And that's it, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Dave Powell from Friends of the Earth. There's a world of difference, I think, between industrial sectors that are green and a green industrial strategy for the whole economy. And this really gets to the heart of something Boaz was talking about. The National Audit Office looked at all of the industrial strategies and said there's no overall commitment to green running through them. So you have an industrial strategy for oil and gas as well as one for offshore wind. So what does the panel think about an overall strategic approach to industrial strategy? And is that a different thing from just having incentives for particular green industries in certain ways? I would argue it is.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Boaz if you could just address the first point, and then Paul, as it's geoengineering. And then I kind of think Greg's talked about the difference between his approach and what he referred to as a Wilsonian one. But we'll maybe let you just address that again briefly.
So geoengineering, I'm going to say first of all what I'm guessing Paul would say, which is that geoengineering is a dangerous thing. So geoengineering just means things like spraying sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere so that you reflect off solar radiation, so the Earth doesn't get so hot. Okay, it's dangerous, it has potential unintended consequences. It's not a good idea, but if the alternative is that we just get incredibly hot, then it's a backstop that you'd want to have available. And the second point I'd make is I do believe that the rest of the world will follow that at some point in this century. So if you go to China, if you go to Russia, okay, those are places that didn't have the 1960s. They believe in science, they believe in engineering, and they're very interested in it.
I think they did have the 1960s in Russia.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Paul, do you want to come in on that?
I think Yuri Gagarin would disagree with you.
Yeah, I mean, if we are stupid enough to allow climate to get very hot so that we feel our backs are up against the wall, and that is the trend we're on, we must be clear, then we will do all sorts of stupid things, because humans do. The only way we will not do stupid things is if we have the time to do the research and then put in place the kinds of strategies that we can do as a potentially intelligent species. At the moment, the science of geoengineering is absolutely at base camp. I mean, if we think the climate science is uncertain, the science of geoengineering is practically unexplored anywhere. And I'm part of the research effort. I believe it should be researched. I believe it should be explored. I think there are huge dangers if our backs are against the wall, that all sorts of countries will say, oh God, we've got to do something, and they'll spray. It's not sulfur dioxide actually, it's sulfuric acid is what you spray up into the stratosphere. And once you've done it, you've got to keep it there, because the carbon dioxide continues to accumulate in the lower atmosphere, and if that protective shield of sulfuric acid were to disappear, the Earth would warm at a faster rate than you can imagine any Earth has ever warmed. And that would certainly be the end of all your birds, and most of us as well. So this is a place we would rather not go, and we do still have an opportunity to avoid it. But before we can even think of doing it, we better get some of the scientific basics straight about it, because at the moment we simply don't know anything about it.
It's worth saying, isn't it, that the summary for policymakers refers to geoengineering in very negative terms, isn't it? So it's not proposing it, it's rather knocking it down. Okay, lady at the front. Oh, sorry, yeah,
Just to say, I don't think we need a green industrial strategy for the whole economy, at least not in the way that you identified it. We do need specific support for sectors that are competing in the global race, and that's not picking individual companies, but it is supporting those right sectors in the way that we support pharmaceuticals or oil and gas, etc. However, I think we do need an overall approach to the economy that drives resource efficiency, that makes us a more resilient economy, that ensures that we have the right infrastructure, that infrastructure is climate resilient, that ensures that we have a low carbon underpinning of our economy as a whole, so that we have electrified ground transport, that we have sustainable non-stressed water supplies. But I think the whole issue of resource efficiency and also focusing on an economy that remains productive and drives profitability, but at the same time reducing inputs and maximises sort of closed loop manufacturing and a closed loop economy. These are really interesting ideas which progressive companies and entrepreneurs are driving forward, and I think government is a little bit behind the loop. And there's interesting work going on. There's a group that I'm involved with a number of Conservative MPs called 2020, and we are looking at how we take this resource efficiency agenda, pulling in climate implications, and really reframe it in a way that government can help that agenda for the economy as a whole.
Thanks, Greg. Lady at the front here, and then lady 2 rows back from, 3 rows back from front.
Laura Cohen, British Ceramic Confederation, the trade association for ceramic manufacturers in the UK. Well, thank you, Minister. I couldn't have had a better introduction. We very much want to be part of the solution to a green economy. Our products are made in a resource efficient way and help save energy for customers, whether it's high temperature processes or durable construction materials. However, we're in danger of decarbonising the UK by deindustrialising. We want to do more to become energy efficient, resource efficient, we do need to develop breakthrough technologies, but because we compete internationally, we are very concerned that we're not getting the signals for investment and a viable business model here in the UK. We are going to have stranded assets. We are going to lose more jobs if we're not careful. What policies, what measures can be made to ensure that there is this strong signal for investment in these green, resource efficient industries that can continue to do more for the economy?
Okay, so particularly a question in the context of Miliband's announcement last week and its impact on the energy industry as well. So I'm throwing that one open to you, Greg. And then
I think, the first minister in the government to really start talking about this issue, because I just didn't believe the analysis that I was getting from my officials when I first went into government, which basically poo-pooed the sort of concerns that you had and showed a table saying, well, if you look at this table, Minister, we've got very competitive energy prices for industry relative to the rest of Europe. I then went to Germany and spoke to the country which has managed to grow both its renewable energy sector and its share of the world market for manufactured goods by quite dramatically over the last decade, and has been able to marry these two. And the reality is Germany has a much more much greater differentiation in its economy between energy-intensive industries and general commerce and industry. So if you're a normal business, typically the average business energy consumption represents less than 10%, it's close to 5%, I think, of cost of sales. If you're a firm of lawyers or you're a retailer or something. But if you're in the ceramics business, or if you make chlorine, or you're a steel manufacturer, it's a huge proportion of your cost of sales. And while you want to drive energy efficiency and you want to drive technological change, there is only so much you can do to defy the laws of physics, certainly as we currently understand technologies. So we have acted to be more like Germany, to recognise that where we can drive energy efficiency, we should be ruthless in doing so and innovative in coming up with new financial incentives and also sticks to drive industry in that way. But we should be more understanding and sympathetic to those sectors that can't or can only go so far. That is why we not only give allowances in the EU ETS, but now, historically, but now we do have a pool of money that's made available by the Chancellor. Now, the bottom line is in Germany, they give out 5 billion euros of rebates to the industry, and that they get state aid approval to do that. We have started down that track. We're giving out £250 million. Well, we have a smaller industrial sector than Germany, smaller manufacturing sector than Germany, so that figure isn't quite as disproportionate as it sounds, but it's not nearly as great. And we recognise that this is a journey. The most important thing is we've recognised this issue, and that we can only afford to do so much given the constraints of the deficit. But you know, Laura, what the process that we've begun, that's being managed by BIS and supported by DEC, in order to help those most energy-intensive businesses, and we're gradually going down the scale to ensure that those most in need get the most assistance.
Anyone else wants to come in on that?
Let's take some more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lady there.
Greg, you're right to stick around for another 5 minutes. Greg.
Thank you. Excuse me, Anna Stanford from Res Group. We're a renewable energy developer. You talked in your opening remarks about green subsidies attracting the ire of consumers, but in fact opinion polls show that the public is very much supportive of investing in renewable energy and support for renewable energy. They're concerned about climate change, they're concerned about relying too much on imported fossil fuels, they support wind energy and solar. I think actually that ire is being stoked by people who prefer to blame green policies rather than rising gas prices for rising bills. So how do we get the message across that in fact investing and supporting and subsidising renewable energy is good value for money, that renewables are actually a bargain for the economy?
Well, I think we do it by being more transparent. I think you're slightly in danger there of taking the argument to the other extreme. I think we just need to be grown up and candid with the consumers and say, you know, it doesn't come cheap. Offshore wind is blooming expensive, much more expensive than, you know, energy that comes from gas-fired power stations. So let's not try and pretend otherwise. Even, you know, solar has come down dramatically, but go back 2 years ago, it was incredibly expensive. And we had to take drastic measures to stop the cost of those tariffs spiralling out of control. So let's not, you know, kid ourselves that all of these things are cheap, because they're not. We're determined to support them because they can come down the cost curve, but some of them have got a long way to come down. So I think we need to be grown up. I think we need to be more transparent. Yes, people are supportive of renewables, that's great. But if you ask a family that's struggling to pay £1,300 for their energy bill, if they mind, you know, paying £100, I mean, it depends on your particular analysis and support, I think, you know, it's not easy for someone. I just think we need to be more candid, more accountable, and more grown up in explaining the costs to them, and not have this sort of happy clappy, well, it's green, therefore we can pay for it. I think we need to constantly make the case for why it's important and demonstrate the value for money. And also, you know, that £100 or so I quoted, that does of course include our energy efficiency programmes, which have a large social component, not just a green element. So even though I totally take your point, because I make it frequently, that the cost of gas is historically in the last 3 years has been the biggest driver of increasing bills. We can't close our eyes to the cost of these things, and we need to demonstrate good value.
Okay, great. You have to go now, don't you?
Apparently.
Yes. Okay. So
I was just going to say very
Guy,
very briefly on that point, Anna, that you know, people say different things in different polls. You know, they want renewables, but at the same time they are super concerned about energy bills, which is why Miliband's announcement plays into that. I don't think in a particularly sophisticated way, but and so, you know, Greg's right. These things do cost more, and the argument that keeps saying these are going to be good value, if they're not good value, then you could be in trouble. So you have to make the argument the investment is worth it, and that's why you have to keep an eye on costs.
many thanks. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Greg, who's having to rush off. And why don't we just say thank you to everyone in there.